When you walk down to the foot of Main Street in Essex Village, you come to the mighty Connecticut River. On your left is a large building that today houses the Connecticut River Museum. The building has stood there for more than 140 years. It was built as a warehouse to store goods coming and going by steamboat, and it was known as the Essex Steamboat Dock. The large doors were where outgoing cargoes were unloaded from wagons, and the riverside doors were for the incoming cargo. Step inside and you can see what those steamboats and this warehouse was all about. Today the museum is still a warehouse of sorts, but instead of products, it houses artifacts or objects. They tell stories from the past about people in the Connecticut River Valley. One of the most important stories is about steam transportation on the river. Just as the digital revolution changed our lives, in the 19th century, steam transportation transformed communication and commerce, and with it, the lives of almost everyone. The Connecticut River was New England's great water highway, and before steamboats came, everything on the water moved by oars or wind on sails. If there was little or no wind from the right direction, it took a very long time to get anywhere. So depending on the wind was tricky. As if that was not a problem, there was the current or the tide. If you were trying to sail out of the river and the tide was coming in, well, you weren't going anywhere fast. Not until the tide turned. Steamboats moved without needing the wind to push them along, and they could climb the river against the tide. Steam, created by boiling water, built up pressure that was harnessed to move paddle wheels instead of sails. The paddle wheels pushed the water behind and moved the boat forward. John Fitch from South Windsor, Connecticut, invented the steamboat, and this oared vessel carried passengers on the Delaware River as early as 1787. The Oliver Ellsworth was the first steamboat in regular service on the Connecticut, beginning in 1824. This early boat burned wood to heat the water and to make the steam. Because boats could only carry a limited amount of wood at one time, the steamboat company paid farmers to bring wagon loads of wood to the various landings where it could be picked up by the boats. The steamers provided a good market for the farmers' wood, but it put pressure on local supplies of firewood, and also, of course, on trees. Fortunately, by the 1840s, steamboats were burning coal from Pennsylvania instead of wood. It came upriver in barges, towed by steam tugboats. Not dependent on the wind or the tide, steamboats could sail on a regular schedule. And because they were fast and got you to your destination on time, steamboats became very popular with the traveling public, but also with farmers who could send fresh produce to larger markets, and with fishermen who could send their shad overnight to the Fulton Fish Market in New York. With manufacturers, with shopkeepers, they all depended on steam transportation, so the boats got bigger very quickly. This is the museum's large working model of a walking beam engine. Steam pressure forced the rods up and down, and that turned the paddle wheel. This is a model of the steamer City of Hartford, and you can see her walking beam. The boat came on the river in 1854, and it was 273 feet long and could carry some 900 passengers. It had sleeping accommodations for 400 of them. There's no picture of the interior, but it was described by a passenger in the Hartford Current. Her cabins and saloons were very spacious and elegantly fitted up with carpets and velvet tapestry in gorgeous patterns. There were rosewood chairs, sofas, and settees. Traveling aboard these elegant steamboats was surely a memorable experience. These large boats provided service between Hartford and New York, but there were several smaller steamers that just served the river landings and Long Island Sound ports such as New London and New Haven. The Silver Star and the Sunshine were boats that you could take to go from Lyme to Middletown to see a ship launching, for example, or to go to Hartford to do your back-to-school shopping. There were also steam ferries that crossed the river and stitched the river towns together. As steamboat technology advanced, the boats shed their heavy walking beam engines and cumbersome paddle wheels for the more efficient propellers. Still driven by steam, they were not as colorful perhaps, but they had more cargo space at a time when Connecticut's industries were expanding with the labor of European immigrants who flocked to our shores. Two similar steel-hulled steamboats shared the route from Hartford to New York and back for some 36 years. You could tell them apart because the Hartford had 2 smokestacks and the Middletown had 1. The steamer Hartford left the capital on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon to begin the 160-mile trip to New York Harbor. Laden with Hartford industrial products, it stopped at 8 landings along the way, picking up more cargo and passengers, and made it to Essex by 9:45 at night. Cargo such as Dickinson's witch hazel that was made in Essex and had been delivered to the Essex steamboat dock in the daytime was now loaded aboard. From the port of New York, steamboats provided connections to expanded markets. Passengers on the boats often stayed up until the boat passed Long Sand Shoal and the Cornfield Lightship before retiring to bed in their cabin at about 11 o'clock. The trip down Long Island Sound took 7 hours, and some people spent the night on chairs on the main deck for just a fraction of what the cost of a cabin. The boat from Hartford arrived in the city 14 hours later at 7 o'clock in the morning, a convenient time if you were in the city to conduct business. The same, much less comfortable trip aboard a stagecoach could take as much as 30 hours, depending on the condition of the road. The steamer Hartford would stay at her New York dock all day loading cargo for the return trip to the Connecticut River. The boat left New York at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and arrived back in Hartford at 7 a.m., having called at Essex at 1 o'clock in the morning. The steam trains of the Valley Railroad connected for New York at Saybrook. They ran alongside the river steamboats for some 40 years, but in the end, the boats were owned by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. During the Great Depression, there was hardly any freight to carry, and unemployed people were not traveling. And so the New York steamboats stopped running, and they never came back. But by then, there had been improvements in trucks and automobiles and in the nation's roads. On October 31st, 1931, when the Hartford came downriver for the last time, there were some small groups of people on the landings to wave goodbye. But no salutes, no ceremonies to mark the end of an era. Some 140 years of dependable steamboating on the Connecticut River just slipped away into history. We invite you to check our website to learn about visiting the Connecticut River Museum. We have lots more stories for you.